Today at the National Press Club, June Oscar. Miss Oscar is the outgoing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner and an advocate for Indigenous languages and women's issues. Today she will ask, what's next for First Nations gender justice? June Oscar with today's address.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's National Press Club Westpac address. My name is Emma MacDonald and I am the Canberra convener of Women in Media. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, June Oscar AO, a proud Bunuba woman from the remote town of Fitzroy Crossing in Western Australia's Kimberley region. June is Australia's outgoing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, having served a 7-year term, and your final week is next week. She's published the landmark Wiyi Thangani Women's Voices report in December 2020 and will discuss its implementation to advance First Nations gender justice and equality in her speech entitled What Next? First Nation Gender Justice. If you would like to join the conversation online, please use the handle @PressClubAust or our hashtag is NPC. Please welcome June.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, everyone. Before I launch into my messaging to you today, I want to say, I speak to you in my first language, Bunuba. I pay my respects to you all, but especially to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri elders, past and present, and acknowledge all First Nations people in the audience today. I acknowledge all of you. Let me begin with a selection of the voices of First Nations women from the thousands of conversations I've had, from remote communities to city centres to the Torres Strait, which have defined my 7-year term as Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. These are direct quotes. Women are the social fabric of communities and the glue that holds everything together. Women from Mount Isa. We are the ones that are the backbone, that everyone depends on to get things done. Women from Cairns. What keeps me strong is my grandmothers. They didn't have the power to have a voice, and I am bloody determined to make sure my girls have a voice. Women from Dubbo. To echo the sentiments of women from Dubbo, I've been absolutely determined through Wiyi Thangani, Women's Voices, the project, which I have led at the Australian Human Rights Commission, to raise the voices of our dynamic First Nation sisterhood to Australia's halls of power and spaces of decision-making. It is the collective triumph of First Nations women and girls, cis and trans and gender diverse mob, that I stand here at the end of my term and can say, because of your voices, we have launched the Wiyi Thangani Institute and Change Agenda for First Nations Gender Justice. I know that our women and girls live rich lives which matter to the healthy formation and growth of societies and environments. But we've been made invisible by a narrow frame of deficit. Through the Institute and Change Agenda, we've put on the national landscape a visionary framework that defines our rights and shows us in our entirety for all the worth we bring to the world. We have a new frame to see us, a First Nations gender justice lens. Our institute, based at the Australian National University, will use this lens and actively reconstruct the social fabric, the bedrock of Australian nation building, to benefit all Australians. As we close one chapter, I thank the Australian Human Rights Commission, all the staff and our President, Professor Rosalind Croucher, and the Australian Government. And in particular, I want to thank Minister Burney and your colleagues, Minister Rishworth and Minister Gallagher, for doing the deep listening for change. Thank you for your vital contribution to the Institute and for committing to intersectional gender equality in this nation. It means so much, and I'm looking forward to the ongoing partnership with the National Indigenous Australians Agency. As we open another chapter, growing the movement for First Nations gender justice, I want to thank Professor Peter Yu, Vice President, First Nations Portfolio at the Australian National University, who has supported the formation of our institute. Professor Yu's big agenda on sustainable economic development is enmeshed and dependent on the strength of the social fabric. As I have reflected on this social fabric, the glue, the backbone of existence that our women spoke so consistently about, I have in mind the women of my life, whose stories are so similar to those raised throughout Yani, Thangani. Like the Dubbo women, my grandmothers are my strength. My grandmother was raised by my great-grandmother, who had lived through what we call in the Kimberley the killing times. Several hundreds of our Bonobo peoples died in this brutal British takeover of our lands in the 1890s. At the time of invasion, there was approximately 2,500 Bonobo peoples. In the 1930s, an anthropologist, Phyllis Cabery, calculated that we had been reduced to a tenth in size. In the greatness of our civilization, spanning millennia, this was apocalyptic. My grandmother, living in the aftermath of this decimation, turned her back on white society. Like others who survived, she used all the knowledge passed to her and refused to send my mother to school, saying to her, "I will teach you everything you need to know." In turn, they both did the same for me. My grandmother lived in a corrugated iron one-room shack just beyond the banks of the creek, where I slept under the stars on our Bonobo country with my mother and my brother. At night, and I can still hear it, the old people would sit around the fire singing about how our people, kin and country are all intertwined. During the days when my mother laboured as an indentured house aide at the Leopold Station homestead, my grandmother would take me walking across our country. We often gathered kapok, a cotton-like fabric, natural fabric, taking its fibres to make our pillows and mattresses. Along the way, she would tell me about plants and significant sites, and we would hunt and stop at waterholes to rest and fish and enjoy the moment. Later, when I was forcibly taken to the mission school in Fitzroy Crossing, and my mother was away at another station, my grandmother was always there, waiting as the truck rolled in at the start of school holidays, anxious and eager to fold us back into our Bonobo world. I now see, when I look back, in this persistent interweaving of Bunuba life practices into our young lives, my grandmother and old people were mending our social fabric and healing our society, keeping an encroaching non-Indigenous world at bay. These seemingly ordinary, everyday acts by the matriarchs who raised me were powerful forms of resistance against a colonial system that had attempted our eradication. A system that insisted this new Australia was not for us, and denigrated our women, implicitly condoning gendered violence, abuse, and rape. All women in this audience will have a sense of this truth, of the struggle to just be you. Surrounded by patriarchal structures which exclude your identity through the dismissal of your experiences and actions to the making of society and economies. For our peoples, it was the colonial myths of gender inequalities and racialised sexism that brought into our realities the violent forces which attempted to disempower and strip our women and men of agency. Long before any feminist or gender equality movements, my matriarchs and the men in our lives knew the vital place of our First Nations women to constructing healthy ecosystems and conditions of balance, wellness, and safety for everyone, no matter your gender, and for all human and more than human relatives. In Bunuba, we say, grow the young as wise elders. And our elders wanted us to become them, to be wanjauru, which means to be a giver. Contained within this concept are the strands of the social fabric spoken of by women throughout Wiyi, Thangani. The teachings to become wanjauru are about reproducing a society where everything is accounted for and embraced. Being wanjauru means we all have responsibilities to regenerate reciprocal relationships of care, safety, kindness, and generosity. These values are fundamentally Australian. Our women and so many other communities across Australia have continued the never-ending, vital and rarely accounted for care work of supporting homes and communities, embedding nurture in the interactions which make life happen. For our women, this is the care work begun by our first mothers of this land. To birth, nurse and teach our children, heal the sick and the wounds of trauma, make medicines, be the crutch and love for elders, and plan and govern the generational health and well-being of our communities. Most importantly, we have been taught to care for the earth and all contained within its ecosystems, the parameters of life as we know it. I don't think we've ever grasped as Australians the enormity of this work, which has, in all truth, stewarded this land for millennia. Our women with their digging sticks, seeds and medicines, generationally tending to the soils and habitats which we now call Australia. home for us all. It is not too much of a leap for all of us to realise that this is the social fabric essential to all Australian realities. Given its central importance to us all, do the structures of Australia truly value this work? This evidence from Wiyi, Yani, Thangani conclusively shows that we are not investing in the social fabric. In fact, as our women have said, the opposite is happening. Because of external forces, it's being torn apart. Women talk of these forces as inequalities, discriminations, punitive welfare measures, and the incessant interventions of the so-called child protection and justice systems. Each have their origins in the colonial domination of the market, with its orientation toward extraction and consumption. Our societal systems of care have been rendered redundant in the face of Western ideal that wealth is gained through money, profit alone. Throughout my early years, moving off country to town communities, I saw this new societal economic order drive either our dispossession, assimilation, or total marginalisation. Then, as today, our women have described to me being stuck in this unimaginable status quo, where our practices of how we use care as the binding agent for healthy existences counts for almost nothing in the Western mainstream, so receives barely any support or investment. This exclusion of our worth to the way broader Australian systems function has had disastrous generational repercussions. Rather than weaving together the social fabric, we are pulling all our reserves into safety nets, constantly responding to the crises born from trauma and hopelessness, those wicked problems of widespread addictions, suicides, family violence, poverty, and cycles of incarceration. Recent research we've released with partners at the ANU and the Queensland University further outlines the burden of care women have and the total lack of recognition that our care work is keeping our societies together. It estimates that the market value of our work in annual salary is between $81,175 to $118,921 per First Nations woman. This is the devaluing of the work that creates the social fabric. There are women who are here who know this reality firsthand, and I'd like to point to Emily Carter, my dear friend and colleague, doing this work in Fitzroy Crossing. Other than tinkering, pardon me, other than tinkering around the edges and an era of self-determination that crumbled, there has never been a comprehensive attempt to value and incorporate our knowledges into the Australian nation-state. These structural failures to accommodate First Nations peoples and the gender justice lens matters. It matters to us all, because the very external forces raised by our women, hurting them, our kin and country, are the forces I see on domestic and international headlines. We label these things unprecedented, but the patterns of their creation feel all too predictable to be surprising. These are growing inequalities, impossible costs of living, extreme housing shortages, rising levels of poor mental health, rapid loss of biodiversity and global heating, mass migrations and conflicts, all disproportionately impacting women and children. There is mass dissatisfaction with the status quo. Everywhere, we are debating how to overcome these current structural predicaments and the types of governance frameworks we need to construct security for all peoples and the planet. As First Nations women were raising with me the need for serious systemic shifts, Australia was rocked by significant periods of reckoning with socioeconomic and health inequalities through the pandemic, racism and police violence through Black Lives Matter, and sexual violence and institutional misogyny when #MeToo hit our capital. In many ways, the referendum for the voice belongs to this historic time of mass movements. Wanting to rectify injustices by creating institutions premised on embracing voices to strengthen our democracy. The referendum, whatever you thought of it, is our mirror for this moment. I still believe it can be a vital wake-up call with the potential to bring all Australians into a process of reckoning with the idea of Australia and how we want this nation-state to embody the values of a diverse Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. We have an incredible multicultural tapestry which forms Australia. Australian families are from across the globe. We need to go on a journey to truly honour that. Referendums place us in a binary. A binary, we know that. But if we look beneath the binary, as the lens of gender justice insists, we will find a much more complex story. Last year, research was released by the ANU, which surveyed Australians immediately after the referendum, examining the reasons for their vote. It's where our mirror begins. For all Australians to reflect deeply upon in understanding who we are and how we should move forward together. This is what stood out for me. There was a large slide of those who would have voted yes in January 2023, who then voted no in October. Whatever way no voters arrived at this conclusion, they said they did not want Australia to be divided. A vast majority of Australians, yes and no, are proud of First Nations cultures and believe the government should help to improve reconciliation. The vast majority believe formal truth-telling processes should happen to acknowledge Australia's shared history. The voice fell victim to what it aimed to counteract. Mass discontent with socio-economic conditions which globally have given rise to sectarianism and populism, fueling a surge in mis- and disinformation. This burgeoning industry of lies and discriminations masquerading as truth and justice erodes our trust toward each other, government institutions, and for me, most significantly, our ability to work together. The public with decision makers, to weave, protect, and sustain the social fabric. We are vulnerable to turning away from one another, to fear and anger. This is the direct opposite to what my grandmother taught me, to become wanjoro. We must all be givers of care and nourishment to each other and the country, the bedrock for life's functions, for communication and decision-making, familial health and sharing resources. And that reciprocal trade, our economies, are formed from and give back to creating these societal conditions. For me, this speaks directly to why the social fabric is critical to strengthening the pillars of democracy, of respectful civic engagement, access to lifelong education, secure and prosperous economies, and robust governance and institutions responsive to public needs. At this fraught time in global affairs, we need this now more than ever. And it is the Australian sentiment post-referendum that tells me Australians want to unite, and we can, through gathering the threads of the past which shapes our present. I said in the opening, others cannot know your worth unless they have the framework to truly see you. I believe the same is true for all Australia. We cannot know the potential of who we can become as a nation state if we cannot truly see ourselves. My grandmother could not reconcile with Western society when she was alive. There was too much compounding trauma, too much. Our existences at the time were denied, emphasised by the fact that my father, a white station owner, never acknowledged me or my Indigenous siblings in his lifetime. Our forebears, understandably, were caught in conflict, but with the unravelling of truth, future generations have the power to see each other and conquer hate with acceptance and love. In the audience is my non-Indigenous brother's son, my wonderful and caring nephew, Samuel, and my Indigenous brother's third daughter, my courageous and beautiful niece, Samantha, and my sister, Marilyn, carrying and teaching our knowledges to the next generation. I'm so proud. In our present and in my grandmother's future, our Indigenous and non-Indigenous worlds have come together. We have gained everything and lost nothing. This is Australia's potential. Ever interconnected, diverse families, where truth through embrace leaves no room for fear and lies that only ever fester in our division. I believe it overwhelmingly be Indigenous and non-Indigenous women and young people from across cultural backgrounds that will guide us into a new era of truth-telling. It will be them. Both groups were more likely to vote yes than men and older people in the referendum. As I have said, women are less likely to see themselves valued in mainstream structures and as such are more open, I think, to understanding the lives of others and forming more inclusive structures. And young people, as I've heard from our First Nations girls, are aspiring to form a different future, not satisfied that the current structures are all we will ever have. The Wiyi, Yani, Thangani Institute for First Nations Gender Justice will harness this energy and willingness for change. It is dialogues of truth between our peoples and non-Indigenous Australians that will deepen collaborations to propel the reconstruction of the social fabric. When we know each other, we can listen without fear and act together with integrity and humility, walking into a future where we lay the foundations to account for everyone and exclude no one. This is the Institute's generational process and purpose, a profound recognition of the lives and knowledges of First Nations women, girls, and gender diverse peoples. To infuse broader Australian nation building about how we co-create the types of cultural, socio-economic conditions for all of us to thrive within, unique to Australia. The mechanisms elevating our voices are everywhere. This institute and other research bodies like the First Nations portfolio at the ANU, the Coalition of Peaks, community-controlled organisations, land councils, as an example. This is the infrastructure we can use to respond to what the referendum has shown us about who we are, so we can move forward. All governments and Australian institutions must show courage to enhance this infrastructure and not let it be diminished so as to trap us in the status quo. Our grandmothers, our matriarchal ancestors gifted us visions for the future to transcend the bounds of a lifetime. My grandmother, like so many women, gave us our knowledges so future generations could use the voice denied to them and reconstruct our ways of being. I exist holding this vision, where I stand tall next to my grandmothers and mother, our feet bare in the warm Pindan soils of our country. Gathered around us are our peoples and hundreds of other women and men with heritages from every part of the world. And there too are my non-Indigenous brothers and sisters, their children and theirs, and so on. We are all holding digging sticks and seeds, and fires are lit. We sing, country hums, all is safe and all is well. Our grandmother's vision is a gift to all Australians. When this nation state is ready to receive it, we can unite, work together, and bring the world back into balance. Yani, thank you.
Thank you, June. Thank you. Our first question today is from the winner of the Caroline Jones Women in Media Young Journalists Award 2023, which is an award that's proudly supported by Women in Media, the National Press Club and Bond University. Charmaine Allison is fittingly an ABC reporter specialising in Indigenous affairs from Alice Springs. Congratulations, Charmaine. And feel free to ask your question.
Charmaine Ellison, ABC Alice Springs. The Northern Territory receives proportionally the largest share of federal funding of any state or territory, but we're seeing very little change on the ground in Central Australian Indigenous communities, which are some of the most disadvantaged in the country, especially when it comes to gender justice. Where do you think we're going wrong?
Beg your pardon?
Where do you think we're going wrong?
Wow, that's a really important question. But I think a question relevant to this country and not just limited to the Northern Territory. I spoke about the stakeholders that are needing to know each other, see each other, and have dialogue with each other. I think it's fair to say that for far too long, many of those stakeholders haven't been included in the conversations to make those brave and courageous decisions truthfully. I understand from my connections in the Northern Territory that there are incredible and amazing Aboriginal leaders in community organisations that have been waiting for a very long time to have the opportunity, to have the dialogue, to recreate and mend and heal the social fabric of the Northern Territory, no matter where you live. But we have to have community leaders and community members involved in those conversations.
June, I would like to ask you, as we broadcast from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land here in the ACT, I must ask you your opinion of the referendum vote breakdown and the fact that the ACT was the only state or territory that voted yes. Why do you think that was?
I think it speaks to well, certainly for me, it's a really, truly nationally missed opportunity for all of us. And, the work that took place in the ACT to support people in understanding what all of this was about and to have the outcome that it did, sadly wasn't to be in other states, other jurisdictions. But I'd like to think that all is not lost there, that we have some serious work to do. We can do this. And the outcome of the referendum now holds the mirror up for each and every one of us as Australians, for us to learn from what we had missed in that opportunity and to roll our sleeves up and to commit to changing that, to doing the work that is necessary so that we do not live forever in this space of unfinished business and that we are uncomfortable to talk about some of these things. It's time. We have the maturity. We are ready.
I'd like to welcome Auntie Matilda, who came in late. And also the next question is Anna Henderson from SBS.
Thank you. June, in 2022, you were joining calls for police to stop carrying guns in remote communities, and you have spoken in the past about the role policing plays. Have your concerns been heard, and do you have ongoing concerns about the challenges for remote communities around how policing interacts with local customs and traditions?
Thank you. That's a really important question. And I come from a region in the Kimberley where the police leadership saw to it that police officers didn't wear guns. Now, that decision was taken by the leadership that worked with communities, that had a very, high respect for the voices of those Indigenous people in the Kimberley that were part of the police service in Western Australia, heeded their advice and sought other ways of engaging and dealing with, some terrifying moments. But this is critical when we allow ourselves to engage and see community and be vulnerable in those environments, those spaces that many of us who come to Aboriginal communities have no idea of, have no lived experiences. We're not prepared. We're not trained. And I know, these were some of the messages that I continue to hear in the conversations I have with people I respect in the West Australian Police Force, that have felt that these approaches has really placed servicemen and women and communities in very difficult situations that can be prevented. I think we need to revisit that and learn from the lessons of how police did work with communities and how effective they were. Thank you.
Next question is Rana Collins from NITV.
Thank you. Thanks, Aunty June. While we wait for substantive change, how can we hold government to account to our ways of knowing, being and seeing in our communities, for governments to work in partnership with our people on the ground, protecting First Nations women and children, and how do we lead that to improved outcomes for our mob?
Thank you. Very important. Keep listening to people. Keep creating the spaces to elevate their voices from their lived realities. Create the opportunities where you can help to inform others who have responsibility and are accountable for making informed decisions. Present the evidence to all of these spaces on whatever the issues may be. Question people around how they're making their decisions if they're not informed by the peoples who are living in that reality, because people who are living in those spaces hold the solutions for change.
Next is Sarah Eisen from The Australian.
Thank you for your speech. I just want to ask two things. The first is, obviously you spoke a lot about the status quo and how we can't stay there. People are wondering what comes next, and Makarrata is something that people are still wondering what's going on there. There's over $20 million that's committed, but no plans exactly as to what happens. Do you think we need to urgently progress that this year, this term? And secondly, if I may, there's been a lot more focus in the last 2 weeks on Alice Springs when it comes to a number of different violent incidences. There's been calls from the Mayor of Alice Springs and some Northern Territory parliamentarians for federal intervention to address that violence. Do you think that's a good idea or a step backwards?
Well, I'll take the latter first. As it's within the last 24 hours.
Yeah.
We will continue to see, that disquiet and those types of behaviours in public if we continue to exclude people and not really see and hear and learn from what are the measures that we collectively can be developing and designing that works for these communities. It can't happen with someone else's ideas that sit in Canberra or Perth or Darwin. It has to be the people from the places where these matters are real issues. Now, I understand there is a senior Aboriginal leadership group in the Northern Territory in Alice Springs made up of key organisations. I don't think it can be expected any longer that someone else from outside of Alice Springs comes in to address what is happening there. It needs to, anyone coming in from outside, and everyone has a right to feel safe here, and so people coming in to contribute to supporting this community should heed the leadership of the people that live in that community. They're the ones that are responding daily to these matters, not someone in Canberra. Mm. And so I think what would be effective is, the stakeholders and, you know, the Mayor working with the organisations in Alice Springs and the leadership in the Northern Territory. And there are some amazing leaders in the Northern Territory.
Absolutely.
And the first one...
Makarrata, yeah.
the Makarrata Commission that was talked about. Look, I think we're absolutely needing a process for truth-telling. We need that to be something that is very, very well considered, that includes, again, the key people from community, from non-Indigenous communities and Indigenous communities to co-create this. It's time. Look, what does it mean to keep pushing it back?
Absolutely. So that it should be still done this term, for example, or is it something we can wait for into the next term of government?
Well, who knows? I think we should get started, and I think we have.
Thank you, June.
June, I don't want to dwell on politics, but would you say Anthony Albanese lost the yes vote or Peter Dutton won the no campaign?
I think the nation lost an opportunity.
Our next question is from Belad Al-Kaki from AAP.
Thank you. Last week, members of the crossbench, including Senator Lydia Thorpe, called for government action on deaths in custody. And one of the suggestions that was made was for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner to oversee implementation of recommendations made from the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. I just wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on this and how might that work?
Thank you for that question. And like many in this room and those listening in, we have asked what has happened to a response to the implementation of the 339 recommendation of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody report. We still remain convinced that many of those recommendations haven't been implemented. So I think Senator Thorpe has touched on a very important issue for many, many families across this country, and I pay my respects to those people who have lost people in custody. And it's a matter for the Australian Human Rights Commission and the incoming Social Justice Commissioner to consider whether or not this important piece of work is carried by the Australian Human Rights Commission and the new Social Justice Commissioner. That'll be a matter for their decision.
Yes. Thank you.
Next question is Dan Holmes from the Mandarin.
Hi, thanks very much for that, June. Very moving talk. You've worked across a bunch of different, or you've looked at First Nations social justice from a lot of different angles throughout the course of your life. I'm wondering if you have any reflections on the difference between working on those problems in the community sector and working on those problems in the public sector.
Oh, right. Good question. Well, as many in the audience here who are working at the community level to bring the attention and awareness, the focus to these priority issues, it is often a struggle to convince people who are in spaces of influence that can make that work easy or easier. So a lot of it is caught up with having to convince others that this is important to invest in. The leadership and the courageous leadership of women in communities on some of these wicked and really challenging problems that no one else wants to take on, it does often fall on women, because women are saying it's unacceptable and we want to change this space. And from my experience, along with my colleague Emily Carter, it had taken us many, many months and years to convince the decision makers. But we had received so much, quick responses from people who live in this country and who knew about what it was that we were trying to bring change about and into in our communities. So, regardless of what these issues are, I'd really like people to invest into rebuilding the social fabric that many Indigenous women are leading on, and they know how to do it. And we have to trust and invest in their leadership. Thank you.
June, your speech was very magnanimous and positive, but I wonder if you could speak to any feelings of anger or despair that you might have had in the lead up to the referendum, and when did you get a sense of how it was going to turn out?
Well, speaking to my own family and my own mob in my own community about this, and people say, what are we doing? What are we voting yes for? So that spoke to me about how perhaps we could have given more time to creating the awareness and educating so many people. And this is not just Indigenous people, it was non-Indigenous peoples as well. And of course, I heard, from non-Indigenous people in the region I live in, of the unfortunate recipients of the misinformation and racist way that that information was delivered. So that was annoying. That. We were made to feel unsafe in having the debate in a civic and civil way, and that really disappointed me.
It was a common refrain, though, that Indigenous people didn't actually want it, and yet when we look at the breakdown of votes, communities where there's more than 50% Indigenous representation clearly voted for it. So in the end, there was that.
That's right, and I saw the results from where the votes were held, and I'm proud to say my little hometown voted overwhelmingly, 95 or 97% for yes, and so did communities in the Northern Territory. So that is false. That we when we were told that Indigenous peoples didn't want this.
Next question is Ginger Gorman from Broad Agenda.
Thank you, June, for that powerful address. And I agree with Emma, it was full of hope. And with that in mind, I wanted to go to the work you're planning to do at Yani, Thangani at the ANU. When we look around us in mainstream society, elders just aren't really valued. I wonder if you could speak to how important it will be, the idea of eldership in terms of achieving First Nations women's justice.
Wow. Well, just to note your point of the speech being hopeful, it's up to every one of us to carry hope. It's easy to slide and to stay not engaged and not to continue this journey. So for women, we carry hope. We must carry hope. We have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren that relies on our ability to remain optimistic and hopeful, and to share that belief and what that brings in terms of our individual acts and contribution to continue to carry the fire in our bellies. So I will always remain hopeful. Oh, don't you worry. I have moments where I think, oh, why me? But, we stay focused because I believe in the greatness of everyone, that we can deliver something different. We have to just hear and see and know each other and work out how we do that together. What was the other question?
The other bit was about, I'm just interested because you've had a deep interest in eldership for so long, senior women. So I just wondered how that notion of eldership would help you achieve First
Oh my goodness, we're all getting there. That's a track that we can't all turn off from. We will all be elders, some sooner than others. But what a wonderful place and space to be in when we reach the point of our eldership. Many of us who have lost senior people far too soon from preventable illnesses have been accelerated into eldership. And so we carry these responsibilities, but with the teachings and the knowledges invested in us, transmitted to us throughout our lifetime. So yeah, I honestly believe that every child is raised to be a wise elder. Imagine if you give them full information. That is your responsibility of the lies transmitted to continue the behaviours that are not helpful to society.
Thank you, Annie June.
Thank you.
The next question is from Samantha Walker.
Thank you, Ngabo. Jalonguru. My Samantha Walker from Ngara Media in the Pilbara. What is First Nation gender justice?
Thank you, Ngabo. Very good question. Gender justice is about everything I shared this morning, but it is to truly see us, to truly see you, the other Indigenous women from the many First Nations country, language groups right across this land who have followed in the footsteps of our first matriarchs, to see us in our entirety, to see us fully, to hear our voices, to work with us, to invest in our solutions. That is what gender justice is.
Thank you.
June, we can't miss this opportunity to ask you about the groundbreaking, world-leading work that you've done on the issue of reducing fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in Indigenous communities. Could you tell us a little bit about how you've achieved great work?
Well, again, I acknowledge my friend, partner, niece, Emily Carter, in the audience, who was the chairperson of the organisation that had the courage in terms of leading that piece of work that those of us who worked for her were supporting. But that was in terms of a response to concerns that women, senior women, elder women, who were caring for children, who they said, this child is very different to my own children and the way I parented there. This child has different needs. That's when they brought that to the attention of Emily and the board and myself as staff at Maninwandigura Women's Resource Centre in Fitzroy Crossing. So after having pursued the alcohol restrictions in Fitzroy Crossing, Emily and I and the board turned our focus on how the flow of alcohol over so many years into so many families were affecting the children. And this is when we were able to reach out and seek the support of the George Institute for Global Health, Professor Elizabeth Elliott, one of the leading experts in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in this country, Professor Fiona Stanley, so people who were child experts, and linking us to international leaders like our friend and sister Carolyn Hartness, a First Nations Eastern Band Cherokee woman leading in this space, working with Indigenous communities in Washington State and in northern Alaska and places. So we were able to have these conversations and understand that we needed to develop criteria for assessment that weren't stigmatising for children, that we were wanting to know what this, the effects of alcohol to a developing brain of a child in utero. And what did that mean? Because we could see the responses by teachers in the local school. We'd see so many children marching up to the principal's office with a red card because of their behaviour. And we thought, this many children can't be all bad. So what is going on here? So we commissioned together, and Emily and I were two of the chief investigators of the research into the prevalence of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in our community. And we were the first community in the history of this country to commission such a piece of work with the researchers. And it took us a few years, but it had to take that time for all of us to truly understand. And it was our duty to then inform the police around the need for their awareness around young children with neurodevelopmental delays who might come across as willful, but they don't have any way of having controls around. Every kid wants to be part of a group and supported and made to feel important, right? And so some of these children were very vulnerable to being led down a very harmful pathway. And, it is that we felt it was so important to raise the awareness among everyone, not just women, that using alcohol during pregnancy, all of these risks are associated with it. So if you're wanting to plan a family, just, abstain from alcohol, regardless of what, colour, creed you are. Alcohol affects the brain and the ability for memory to be retained. For us, as coming from an oral tradition heritage, the memory part is so critical. So who's going to sing those songs? Who's going to keep those stories? So, it was urgent that we looked at this and treated it with as a huge priority. And I think from the work that our community had done, Australia has benefited from that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I hope I answered your question.
Another quick question from Anna Henderson.
Yes, thank you so much. Anna Henderson from SBS again. Just in terms of the wish to raise the age of criminal responsibility across the country, it has taken a very long time for different jurisdictions to grapple with this issue. What's your view of whether this is, in a sense, somewhat of a failed legacy because of the lack of action in some places? And what's your message to those political leaders who are yet to move?
Well, firstly, can I say I don't believe in locking children up. I think that act speaks to our incompetence, our inability to respond in a far more therapeutic, healing and rights-based way. There's so many issues that contribute to a child coming into police contact and then into juvenile detention. Many of these children are babies. They're babies, and I'm sure we've all heard a child is a child for life. And so when we look at criminal age of responsibility, and yes, there are, the cases for, whether it should be 10 years of age, 14. I just think children are children. We should be treating children based on their rights, based on the need for guidance, for support, for love, as we've heard in the messaging from the grandmothers who are calling for the closure of Don Dale, from the women who stand outside of those detention centres and argue based on humanity and fair treatment of children. I think that's a key point that we need to revisit. Do we want to set an age in a child's life when they have issues of early life trauma? They are living either with at the impact and are anywhere on the spectrum of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. There are other issues, but there are other ways of responding far more supportively and in a more caring and loving way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And our final question today is back to Sarah Iceland.
Thank you again for today. I just wanted to ask about some comments of one of your predecessors, another Commissioner, Mick Gooder. Mick Gooder said at a federal level 4 or 5 months after a referendum, he feels as though things have come to somewhat of a standstill in Indigenous affairs. I wanted to ask if you agree or have a different point of view.
Well, I think because of the outcome of the referendum, that has given many, many people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, to just sit and take a few deep breaths and to make sense of what had just happened. Many of us needed time and space. And I think that may be true for people needing a longer time. But I think as we arise from these places where we've been in quiet contemplation and reflection, that we give each other the energy and the hope that we can do this. But how we do that, that needs us to come together and have those conversations around, well, how do we do this in a different way and learn from what we have just experienced.
Thank you.
Stay with me, June. I just want to present you with a special National Press Club membership to thank you for an outstanding speech, an amazing job, and much great work to come from you in the future. Thank you so much.
Emma.